Sometimes the people we dismiss as worthless hold the greatest treasures of all. In a world that tosses aside the elderly like broken tools, one woman's story will remind you that love sees what others refuse to acknowledge. At a slave auction in ancient Norway, Bjarnulf the giant points to Ragnar, an older woman with graying hair and soft hands. The crowd laughs at his choice. Why would a feared warrior want someone past her prime? But Bjarnulf remembers the gentle voice that once sang him to sleep as a starving boy. He remembers the hands that healed his wounds before he became a legend. What the mocking crowd doesn't understand is why a man who conquered armies would choose dignity over beauty. What secret connects this unlikely pair that makes their bond stronger than steel? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Ragnar felt its chill seep through the rough woolen cloak that barely covered her shoulders. She stood among the other wares at Eriksfjord's weekly market, but unlike the cattle lowing in their pens or the bolts of cloth displayed on wooden tables, she understood every cruel word spoken about her worth. "Look at that one," sneered Gunnar the merchant, his gold arm rings catching the pale sunlight. "Past her childbearing years, soft as fresh butter, and probably eats more than she's worth in labor." Ragnar kept her eyes fixed on the weathered planks. Beneath her feet, but her fingers found the small silver pendant hidden beneath her dress. Thor's hammer, no larger than a child's thumb, worn smooth by decades of worried touching. It was all she had left of the woman she once was, when she bore a different name and commanded respect in halls now burned to ash. The crowd gathering for the morning auctions represented the hard edge of Viking society. Farmers seeking strong backs for harvest, jarls looking for household servants, and occasionally men whose purposes were better left unspoken. They moved through the human merchandise with the same calculating eyes they'd used to judge livestock, pinching arms to test muscle, examining teeth, dismissing anyone who showed signs of age or weakness. Ragnar had learned to make herself small in such places. At 53 winters, with silver threading through her once golden braids and her body carrying the soft curves of a woman who had borne children and lived through famines, she knew she was considered the dregs of the slave market. Her son Thorvald had made that abundantly clear when he'd sold her to pay his gambling debts. "She can cook and mend," he'd told the slave trader with all the emotion of a man selling an old plough horse. "Knows herbs for healing. Might be worth something to someone." The embroidered leather pouch at her waist held what remained of her healer's supplies: dried meadow sweet for pain, willow bark for fevers, chamomile for restless sleep. These herbs had been her companions through 30 years of tending the sick and wounded in her village. She'd delivered babies, set broken bones, and eased the dying into their final rest. But none of that mattered now. Here she was simply another piece of property waiting for someone to find her useful. The auctioneer, a gap-toothed man named Sigurd, began his morning ritual of displaying the human goods. Young men flexed their muscles and tried to look fierce. Pretty girls kept their eyes downcast, while potential buyers examined them like prized mares. Children clung to their mothers, understanding little except that their world had been turned upside down. "This lot came from a raid on the Frankish coast," Sigurd announced, gesturing to a group of fair-haired captives. "The men are strong, the women skilled in weaving and household management. The children will grow into loyal servants if trained properly." Ragnar had not come from a raid. She was Norse-born, a free woman, until circumstances and bad luck had stripped away everything she'd once possessed. The irony was bitter as old herbs. She who had spent her life healing others now found herself broken and discarded. The crowd parted suddenly, and conversations died to whispers. Even from her position among the other human goods, Ragnar could see why. Bjarnulf Ironhand walked through the market like a force of nature given human form. He stood a full head taller than most men, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms thick as ship's masts. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of battles that had made his name legend across the northern kingdoms. But it wasn't his size that silenced tongues. Bjarnulf carried. Violence, like other men, carried cloaks, always present, ready to be thrown off at a moment's notice. Stories followed him like wolves, entire war bands slaughtered by his axe, enemy strongholds burned to their foundations, kings who paid him tribute rather than face his wrath. He was called the Giant, not just for his height, but for the enormity of his reputation. Bjarnulf, merchants called out respectfully, what brings you to our humble market? Surely nothing here is worthy of your attention. The warrior's pale, blue eyes swept over the assembled goods with the same methodical attention he might give to planning a siege. He paused at the pen holding the strongest young men, examined the display of weapons and armor, considered a particularly fine stallion that stamped and snorted in its enclosure. Ragnar found herself studying this legend, made flesh. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way he held his massive hands, stirred a memory she couldn't quite grasp. She'd encountered many warriors in her time as a healer, men whose bodies bore the marks of countless battles, but there was something familiar in the way this one moved, careful and controlled despite his obvious power. Begin the bidding, Bjarnulf commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. Sigurd nearly tripped over himself in his eagerness to comply. Of course, my lord. Where shall we start? The young warriors. Perhaps this one here fought 3 men before we brought him down. The morning auction proceeded with the predictable rhythm Ragnar had witnessed too many times. Strong backs sold for good silver. Pretty faces brought premium prices. Skills like smithing or weaving added value. She watched it all with the detached numbness that had protected her sanity these past months, knowing her turn would come when the choice goods had been claimed. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the stark beauty of the fjord country. Steep mountains rose like the walls of the god's own hall, their peaks touched with snow, even in summer. Pine forests cloaked their slopes in deep green, and eagles circled high overhead, riding the updrafts with lazy grace. This was a land that bred hard people, men and women who could wring life from stone and ice, who measured worth in survival and strength. It was also a land that had no patience for the weak or old. When her turn finally came, Ragnar stepped forward. With as much dignity as she could muster, she kept her back straight and her chin raised, though inside she felt like a sparrow among hawks. The crowd's reaction was immediate and predictable. "What's this old sow?" someone called out. "Sigurd, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel now. She's got some meat on her bones," another voice added with crude laughter. "Might keep a man warm on cold nights if he's not particular. 50 years if she's a day. What use is that?" Ragnar had endured worse insults, but they still stung. She focused on the horizon, on the distant peaks where eagles soared free, and tried to remember who she'd been before the world had reduced her to this moment. Sigurd, clearly uncomfortable with the crowd's reaction, hurried through his standard pitch. "This woman has skills in healing and herbcraft. She can cook, clean, mend clothing." "For how long?" interrupted a farmer. "She'll be dead of old age before the first snows." The laughter that followed was cruel, but not unusual. Ragnar had seen it before, the way people found humor in others' misfortune, as if mockery could somehow protect them from similar fates. She bore it silently, as she'd learned to bear all things. That's when Bjarnulf raised his hand. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but it cut through the crowd's noise like an axe through green wood. Every voice stilled, every eye turned to the giant warrior who had just expressed interest in the market's least valuable offering. "I'll take her," he said simply. The silence that followed was so complete that Ragnar could hear her own heartbeat. Then the laughter erupted, not the casual cruelty of before, but genuine disbelieving mirth. Warriors slapped their thighs, merchants wiped tears from their eyes. Even some of the other slaves looked confused by this unexpected turn. "Did you hear that?" gasped Gunnar between fits of laughter. "The giant wants the old cow!" "Bjarnulf, my friend," called out Harold the shipbuilder, "surely you jest. Why burden yourself with such—" He gestured dismissively at Ragnar. "When you could have any of the young ones." But Bjarnulf wasn't laughing. His pale eyes remained fixed on Ragnar with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something in that gaze, recognition perhaps, or memory stirring like smoke from a long cold fire. "State your price," he told Sigurd, ignoring the crowd's continued amusement. The auctioneer, clearly flustered by this unexpected development, stammered out a figure that was far too low for a slave sale, but seemed appropriate for what everyone considered worthless. Goods. Bjarnulf didn't haggle. He simply reached into his belt pouch and counted out the silver, each coin ringing against the wooden table with the sound of finality. As the laughter gradually died and the crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads at the warrior's strange choice, others already spreading the story that would be told in ale halls for months to come, Ragnar found herself owned by a man whose reputation could freeze blood in winter veins. But when he approached her, when he stood close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow and smell the leather and iron scent that clung to his clothes, he spoke to her with unexpected gentleness. "Come," he said simply. "You're going home." Home! The word hit her like a physical blow. She'd had a home once, a small house with a garden where she grew her healing herbs, a kitchen where she prepared meals for a family that loved her, a place where she'd been valued for her wisdom, rather than mocked for her age. That home was gone now, sold along with everything else to satisfy her son's debts. As she followed Bjarnulf through the market, past the stares and whispers of those who couldn't understand his choice, Ragnar clutched her hidden pendant and wondered what manner of fate had just claimed her. The stories said he was a killer, a destroyer of men and cities. But the hand he'd placed briefly on her shoulder to guide her direction had been surprisingly gentle. Whatever awaited her in this giant's hall, it had to be better than the slave market's cruel assessments of her worth. At least, she hoped it would be. In her 53 winters, she'd learned that hope was sometimes all that stood between survival and surrender. The morning mist was fully gone now, burned away by a sun that promised warmth despite the northern latitude. As they walked toward whatever future awaited, Ragnar allowed herself one small ember of that precious hope to kindle in her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, her story wasn't over yet. The wagon journey from Eriksfjord to Bjarnulf's homestead took most of the day, following winding paths that carved through pine forests and skirted the edges of deep lakes that reflected the sky like polished bronze. Ragnar sat in the back of the sturdy cart, surrounded by sacks of grain and barrels of ale that represented the warrior's other purchases from the morning market. She tried to make sense of what had happened, but each attempt only led to more questions. Why had he chosen her? The question gnawed at her like hunger in a lean winter. She'd seen the quality of goods available: strong young men who could work fields or fight battles, skilled craftsmen who could forge weapons or build ships, beautiful women who could grace any warrior's hall. Yet Bjarnulf the giant, who could have claimed any prize, had pointed at her. The warrior himself rode ahead on a massive destrier that seemed better suited to carrying siege engines than men. Even mounted, his presence dominated the landscape. Other travelers they passed on the road showed him the deference due to a man of his reputation, moving aside, offering respectful nods, some even bowing deeply. But none dared approach close enough for conversation. Ragnar found herself studying his broad shoulders and the way he held the reins with surprising gentleness for such large hands. Something about his silhouette stirred memories that danced just beyond her grasp, like trying to remember a half-forgotten song from childhood. The homestead, when they finally reached it, was far more modest than she'd expected for a warrior of such renown. Yes, it was prosperous. The long hall was well built from seasoned timber, the outbuildings were in good repair, and she could see extensive fields where barley and oats rippled in the afternoon breeze. But it wasn't the fortress she'd imagined, nor the ostentatious display of wealth that many successful warriors favored. Instead, it felt like a place where someone actually lived and worked, where comfort mattered more than intimidation. As Bjarnolf helped her down from the wagon, his massive hand completely enveloping hers, the household servants emerged to greet their master's return. Ragnar counted perhaps a dozen people, from a grizzled steward who looked old enough to have served Bjarnolf's father to a girl barely past childhood who ducked behind the others when she saw the stranger. "Thorstein," Bjarnolf addressed the steward. "This is Ragnar. She'll be staying with us. See that she's given the small room near the herb garden." The old steward's weathered face showed only the slightest surprise. In the household where the master had probably brought home stranger things than aging slave women, perhaps this didn't merit much reaction. "Of course, my lord. Shall I assign her duties? Let her rest today. We'll discuss her place here tomorrow." Ragnar almost smiled at the phrase, "her place here." In most households, a slave's place was clearly defined: kitchen work, cleaning, field work, or serving the master's personal needs. But something in Bjarnolf's tone suggested he hadn't yet decided what her role would be, as if her presence solved a problem she didn't yet understand. The small room proved to be more comfortable than anywhere she'd slept in months. It had a narrow window that looked out on a carefully tended garden, where she could see rows of familiar plants: comfrey for healing wounds, feverfew for headaches, valerian for restless sleep. Someone here understood the value of growing medicine alongside food. That evening she was invited to eat in the great hall with the rest of the household. This was unusual. Most slaves ate separately after their betters had finished. But Bjarnolf gestured for her to sit at one of the long tables, and no one dared question his decision. The meal was simple but abundant: thick barley stew with chunks of mutton, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, cheese aged in the mountain caves, and ale that was strong without being harsh. As she ate, Ragnar listened to the evening conversation and began to understand the character of this strange household. Bjarnolf, despite his fearsome reputation, was clearly a thoughtful master. He asked after the pregnant ewes, discussed the timing of the grain harvest with his field hands, and settled a dispute between two farm workers with patience rather than force. When young Astrid, the kitchen girl, accidentally spilled ale on his sleeve, he simply smiled and told her to be more careful. This wasn't the behavior she'd expected from a man whose name was whispered in the same breath as words like berserker and deathbringer. As the evening wore on and the ale flowed more freely, some of the household began to tell stories. These weren't the grand tales of Bjarnolf's battlefield exploits that were sung in king's halls, but smaller, more personal memories. Thorstein spoke of how the master had once carried him on his back for 3 miles after a horse threw him and broke his leg. Helga the cook remembered how he'd sat up all night tending her fevered son when the boy nearly died of lung sickness. "He's not what people think," Astrid whispered to Ragnar during a lull in the conversation. "The stories make him sound like a monster, but he's never raised his voice to any of us." "Not once." Ragnar nodded but said nothing. She was still trying to understand her place in this unexpected household, still puzzling over why a warrior of Bjarnolf's stature would burden himself with an aging slave woman. Her answer came late that night, when most of the household had retired to their beds and the great hall held only the dying embers of the hearth fire. She'd been unable to sleep. Too many changes, too many questions, so she'd wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and stepped outside for some air. The night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like scattered silver coins. She was standing in the herb garden, breathing in the familiar scents of her healing plants, when she heard footsteps behind her. You couldn't sleep either, Bjarnulf said quietly. She turned to face him, surprised by how different he looked without his mail and weapons. Dressed in a simple wool tunic and leggings, he seemed less like the legendary giant and more like... The memory hit her like a physical blow. A boy, perhaps 12 winters old, lying fevered and half dead in the small shelter behind her house. His clothes had been little more than rags, his ribs clearly visible beneath skin, stretched tight with starvation. She'd found him collapsed in her garden one morning, more skeleton than child, burning up with fever. She'd nursed him for nearly a month, feeding him thin broths when he was too weak to chew, cooling his fever with wet cloths, singing old songs, to keep him calm during the worst nights. He'd been delirious most of that time, calling out for his mother in a voice that broke her heart. When he'd finally recovered enough to travel, he'd carved her a small wooden cup with his eating knife. Clumsy, work from unpracticed hands, but made with obvious care. He'd left it on her table, along with a few wildflowers, disappearing into the morning mist, without even telling her his name. She'd never seen him again. That was over 40 years ago, you remember, Bjarnulf said softly, and she realized he'd been watching her face in the starlight. The fevered boy, she whispered. You were the fevered boy. He nodded slowly. You saved my life, fed me, healed me, gave me strength to continue when I had nothing left. I never forgot your kindness. You were so thin, so frightened. What had happened to you? Raiders killed my family, burned our farm. I wandered for weeks, eating roots and berries when I could find them, drinking from streams. I was dying when I collapsed in your garden. Ragnar's throat tightened with memory and emotion. You left before I could properly say goodbye. One morning, you were just gone. I was ashamed, he said simply. A boy who couldn't protect his own family, couldn't even feed himself. I thought if I became strong enough, if I proved myself worthy, perhaps someday I could return and thank you properly. And instead you found me at a slave auction. When I heard your name, when I saw your face. He shook his head. How could the woman who saved my life end up in such circumstances? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Ragnar looked up at this giant of a man and still saw traces of that frightened, fevered boy she'd once cradled in her arms while he fought for life. The world changes, she said finally. Fortune turns. The strong become weak, the wealthy become poor. I lost everything when my husband died. My son, she stopped, unable to voice the betrayal that still burned in her chest. You'll never be sold again, Bjarnulf said with quiet intensity. Never be mocked or dismissed or treated as worthless. I give you my oath on that. Standing there in the herb garden under the star-filled sky, with the scent of healing plants all around them, and 40 years of separation bridged in a single evening, Ragnar felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. She felt safe. But safety, she'd learned, was often the most fragile thing of all. As she looked at this man who'd grown from the boy she'd saved, she wondered what storms this unexpected kindness might bring. In a world where strength was the only currency that mattered, what price would they both pay for choosing compassion over cruelty? The wooden cup he'd made for her all those years ago was long gone, lost in the destruction of her old life. But standing here now, she realized that some gifts transcend their physical form. The kindness she'd shown a dying boy had returned to her when she needed it most, carried in the heart of a man who'd never forgotten her gentle hands and healing. Songs. Perhaps that was how grace worked in this harsh world. Not as lightning from the gods, but as seeds planted in kindness and harvested in unexpected seasons. The morning brought with it the complex reality of fitting into a household where everyone already had their established roles and rhythms. Ragnar woke before dawn, as had been her habit for decades, and found herself uncertain of her place in this new world. In her old life, she would have been tending her own garden by now, preparing healing draughts for the day's patients, or kneading bread for her family's breakfast. Here, she was neither family nor servant, neither guest nor true slave. She existed in some undefined space that left her feeling adrift. She dressed quietly and made her way to the herb garden, drawn by the familiar comfort of growing things. The morning air was crisp, with the promise of autumn, and dew clung to the leaves of plants she knew as well as old friends. Someone had tended this garden with skill. The rows were straight, the plants healthy, the soil rich with compost. But she could see areas where knowledge was lacking, herbs that would benefit from different placement or companions that would strengthen their healing properties. From her hidden belt pouch, she withdrew a flat stone she'd carried since her youth. Its surface was covered with tiny symbols she'd carved over the years, not the formal runes that Skalds used for their stories, but her own system for remembering recipes and preparations. This stone held the accumulated wisdom of 30 years of healing, each mark representing knowledge gained through success, failure, and careful observation. "You rise early," she turned to find Thorstein approaching, moving with the careful gait of a man whose bones remembered too many harsh winters. The old steward carried himself with dignity despite his age, and she recognized a kindred spirit in his weathered features. "Old habits," she replied simply. "In my former life, the sick don't wait for convenient hours." He nodded approvingly. "A healer, then. I wondered why the master chose someone of your—" he paused diplomatically, "experience over younger options. Did you tend this garden? Helga and I do what we can, but neither of us has the proper knowledge. We grow what we remember our mothers growing, but many of the finer points are lost to us." He gestured toward a section where several valuable plants were struggling. Those were supposed to be for joint pain, but they've never thrived as they should. Ragnar knelt beside the failing plants, examining their placement and soil condition. "They need more drainage and less morning sun. Comfrey prefers different conditions than what you've given it here." She looked up at him. "If I may." Thorstein's face showed both surprise and relief. "The master said to let you find your own place here. Perhaps this is it." Over the next few hours, Ragnar threw herself into the work of understanding and improving the medicinal garden. She moved plants that were in wrong locations, amended soil that lacked proper drainage, and began preparing beds for herbs that were missing entirely. The physical labor felt good after months of helpless waiting in markets and holding pens. As she worked, various members of the household found reasons to pass by the garden. Some were openly curious about the woman their master had purchased. Others seemed to be evaluating whether she might be useful or merely another mouth to feed. She sensed no hostility. Bjarnulf's people seemed to take their cues from him, and his acceptance of her had granted her a provisional place in their community. Young Astrid was the first to approach directly, bringing a wooden cup of fresh milk, and watching with obvious fascination as Ragnar prepared a new planting bed. "What are you planting there?" the girl asked, her voice holding the careful politeness of someone unsure of another's status. "Meadow sweet," Ragnar replied, accepting the milk gratefully. "For pain relief and fever. This location should give it the right amount of sun and moisture. Helga says you know healing. Could you teach me? My grandmother knew such things, but she died before passing them on." The request touched something deep in Ragnar's heart. She'd always believed that knowledge should be shared, that the wisdom of healing belonged to the community rather than to individuals. "If your duties allow time for learning, I would be honored to teach you what I know." Astrid's face lit up with genuine joy. "I'll ask Helga if I can spend mornings with you after the bread is set to rise." As the girl hurried away, Ragnar felt the first stirring of purpose she'd experienced since her world had collapsed. Perhaps she could still be useful, still contribute something of value to the lives around her. The afternoon brought a different challenge. Bjarnulf's return from checking his outlying fields was accompanied by two of his neighbors, prosperous farmers who'd clearly come to satisfy their curiosity about their famous neighbor's unusual purchase. Eric Longbeard and Olaf the Stout were cut from the same cloth as most successful Viking men, practical, direct, and unimpressed by anything that didn't contribute obvious value to their lives. They examined Ragnar with the same assessing eyes she'd endured at the slave market, though with slightly more courtesy due to Bjarnulf's presence. "So this is your new acquisition," Eric said, his tone carefully neutral. "Unusual choice, my friend." Bjarnulf's response was mild but carried an edge of warning. "I chose what suited my needs." "Of course," Olaf added quickly, "though I admit I'm curious about what you see that the rest of us missed. She's not exactly built for heavy labor." Ragnar felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression composed. She'd learned long ago that defending herself against such comments only made them worse. Better to let her actions speak when the opportunity arose. "Everyone has their uses," Bjarnulf replied. "Ragnar has skills that aren't immediately obvious." "Ah," Eric nodded knowingly. "Winter comfort, then. A man gets lonely in the cold months." The crude assumption hung in the air like smoke from green wood. Ragnar saw Bjarnulf's jaw tighten slightly, though his voice remained level when he spoke. "Careful, Eric. You speak of a woman under my protection." The subtle threat in those words was unmistakable. Eric raised his hands in mock surrender, but Ragnar could see the speculation in his eyes. The story would spread. Bjarnulf the giant, keeping an aging slave woman for unnamed purposes. The truth was more complex and more honorable than the rumors would suggest, but she'd lived long enough to know that truth rarely survived intact when carried by gossiping tongues. After the neighbors left, Bjarnulf found her in the garden, where she'd returned to work off her frustration through physical labor. "I apologize for their rudeness," he said without preamble. "You needn't apologize for others' thoughts. I've heard worse. That doesn't make it acceptable." She straightened from her work, studying his face. "You realize what this looks like to them, what conclusions they'll draw. Let them draw whatever conclusions they wish. My household knows the truth of your place here." But even as he said it, Ragnar wondered if anyone truly understood her place here, including herself. She was grateful beyond measure for his kindness, touched by his loyalty to the memory of her care for him as a boy. But she also recognized the precarious nature of her situation. She was neither family nor hired help, neither honored guest, nor traditional slave. Her position depended entirely on Bjarnulf's continued goodwill and protection. As evening approached, and she helped Helga prepare the evening meal, contributing knowledge of herbs and seasonings that elevated the simple fare, Ragnar reflected on her first full day in this new life. She'd found useful work, begun to earn the respect of at least some household members, and felt the stirring of purpose that had been absent for so long. But she'd also seen the questions in neighbors' eyes and felt the weight of depending on one man's protection in a world that gave women few rights and older women even fewer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove her worth or reveal her vulnerabilities. Tonight, though, she would allow herself to hope that this strange new chapter of her life might offer more than mere survival. Perhaps, with careful steps and quiet determination, she could build something resembling home in this place where a boy she'd once saved had grown into a man who remembered kindness. 3 weeks had passed since Ragnar's arrival at Bjarnulf's homestead, and the rhythm of her new life had begun to feel less foreign. Her mornings were spent in the herb garden with Astrid, teaching the eager girl to identify plants by their leaves, flowers, and scent. Her afternoons were often occupied helping Helga in the kitchen, where her knowledge of which herbs complemented different foods had already improved the household's meals. Evenings found her mending clothes or preparing healing supplies, work that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. It was during one such evening that the first real test of her value came. Bjarnulf had been working with his men to repair a section of roof damaged by the previous week's storm. The job required lifting heavy beams and balancing on steep slopes, dangerous work even for experienced builders. When Magnus, one of the younger farmhands, lost his footing and fell, his scream of pain brought everyone running. Ragnar reached him first, dropping to her knees beside where he lay clutching his right leg. Even through his leggings, she could see the unnatural angle of his shin bone, and the growing stain of blood suggested the break had torn through skin as well. Around, her men muttered darkly about the bad luck of such injuries so close to harvest time. "Get me clean cloths, hot water, and my herb pouch," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with such crises many times before. "Thorstein, I need you to send someone for strong ale, not the usual table brew, but the strongest you have, and clear a space in the hall where I can work with good light." For a moment the men hesitated. In their world, warriors dealt with battlefield injuries through gritted teeth and crude field medicine. But something in Ragnar's confident manner convinced them to follow her instructions. As they carefully moved Magnus to the great hall, Ragnar mentally catalogued what she would need. The break was serious, but not beyond her skills. She'd set dozens of similar injuries over the years. The bleeding would need to be controlled first, then the bone realigned and splinted properly. Most importantly, the wound would need thorough cleaning to prevent the rot that killed more injured men than the original trauma. From her personal stores, she withdrew a small piece of faded blue cloth that she'd carried for decades. It had once been part of a dress, the dress she'd worn the summer she'd nursed a fevered boy back to health. She'd kept this scrap not from sentiment, but because the fabric was finely woven and had proven useful for delicate medical work. Now she tore it into strips for bandages, each piece representing a connection to the woman she'd been when healing was her calling rather than her survival. "This will hurt," she warned Magnus as she began cleaning the wound with boiled water. "And strong spirits. But you must stay still if you want to keep the leg." The young man bit down on a leather strap and endured her ministrations with the stoic courage expected of a Norse warrior, though sweat beaded his forehead and his knuckles went white from gripping the table edge. Bjarnulf had arrived by this point, still wearing his work clothes and carrying the tension of a leader whose man had been injured under his watch. He positioned himself where Magnus could see him, offering the comfort of steady presence while Ragnar worked. "You know what you're doing," Bjarnulf observed quietly as she carefully realigned the broken bone. "I've done this before, many times." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking that the bone ends met properly before beginning the careful process of wrapping and splinting. "The break is clean, and I've got the bleeding stopped. If he follows instructions and keeps the leg elevated and still, it should heal properly." Around the hall, household members had gathered to watch. Some seemed impressed by her skill and confidence, others merely curious about this practical demonstration of her abilities. But Ragnar could sense a shift in their attitudes. She was no longer just the aging woman their master had inexplicably purchased, but someone who possessed valuable knowledge. As she secured the final bandages and mixed a dose of willowbark tea for Magnus's pain, young Astrid approached with obvious awe. "How did you learn all that?" the girl asked. "The way you moved his leg, the medicines you used, it was like watching magic." "Not magic," Ragnar replied, washing the blood from her hands in a basin of clean water. "Just knowledge gained through years of practice. Every break I've set, every wound I've cleaned, every fever I've treated has taught me something. Experience is the greatest teacher of healing arts." Over the following days, as Magnus's leg began to mend properly and he regained strength, word of Ragnar's medical skill spread beyond the immediate household. It started with Helga mentioning to her sister during a market visit how expertly their master's new woman had handled the injury. From there, the story grew in the telling, as such stories do. Within a week, Olaf the Stout arrived at Bjarnulf's door with his youngest son, whose persistent cough had worsened despite his wife's attempts at treatment. The boy was thin and pale, clearly struggling to breathe properly. "I've heard your woman has healing knowledge," Olaf said to Bjarnulf, his earlier skepticism replaced by a parent's desperate hope. "My wife has tried everything she knows, but the boy only gets worse." Ragnar examined the child carefully, listening to his labored breathing and noting the bluish tinge around his lips. She'd seen similar symptoms before, usually in children, who lived in homes with poor ventilation or who'd been exposed to too much smoke or damp air. "Bring him inside where I can see him properly," she instructed, leading them to the bright main room of the hall. After a thorough examination, she prepared a steam tent using hot water infused with pine needles and wild thyme. As the aromatic vapor began to ease the boy's breathing, she mixed a syrup from honey, coltsfoot, and other herbs. "He needs this treatment twice daily," she explained to Olaf. "The steam will help clear his lungs, and the syrup will soothe the inflammation. Also, you must look to the air in your home. Does he sleep near a hearth that smokes? Is his bedding damp from roof leaks?" Olaf's face showed dawning understanding. "The boy's sleeping alcove is right next to the cooking fire. We thought the warmth would help his cough." "The warmth helps, but not if it comes with smoke. Move his bed to where he can stay warm but breathe cleaner air." Within days, the boy's breathing had improved dramatically. Olaf returned not only to pay for the treatment, offering silver that Bjarnolf quietly redirected to Ragnar herself, but also to express his sincere apology for his earlier dismissive comments. "I spoke without knowledge," he admitted, his usual bluster replaced by genuine respect. "You have skills that are worth more than gold to a parent with a sick child." As autumn deepened and more people sought her help, a farmer's wife with joint pain that prevented her from working, an elderly craftsman whose hands shook too badly to hold his tools, a young mother whose baby wouldn't settle into sleep, Ragnar found herself stepping back into the role that had defined her adult life. She was a healer again, valued for her knowledge and sought out for her skills, but more than that, she was beginning to see how her presence was changing the household itself. Astrid had progressed from asking simple questions to helping with actual treatments. Magnus, recovered from his injury, had become fiercely protective of the woman who'd saved his leg. Even Thorstein, initially cautious about her undefined status, now consulted her on matters ranging from the health of livestock to the best herbs for preserving winter food stores. One evening, as she sat by the fire preparing healing supplies for the next day's patients, Bjarnolf settled into the chair beside her. "You've found your place here," he observed. "It seems I have." She looked up from the leaves she was grinding into powder. "Though I suspect it's not quite what either of us expected when you made that bid at the market." "No," he agreed. "It's better than I expected. You're not just surviving here, Ragnar. You're thriving. And so is everyone around you." As she looked around the hall at the faces of people who now sought her advice and valued her presence, Ragnar realized he was right. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she wasn't just enduring each day, she was living it with purpose and dignity restored. But even as contentment settled around her like a warm cloak, she couldn't shake the feeling that this peaceful time was fragile. In her experience, happiness that came too easily was often happiness that could be taken away just as easily. Still, she would cherish these good days for however long they lasted. The first signs of trouble arrived with the changing of the seasons. As the leaves turned gold and crimson and the first frost touched the fields, visitors began appearing at Bjarnolf's homestead with increasing frequency. Not patients seeking healing, but warriors and jarls whose conversations with their host carried undertones that made Ragnar uneasy. She first noticed the change during the harvest feast, when neighboring landholders gathered to celebrate the successful bringing in of the crops. What should have been a joyful occasion felt heavy with unspoken tensions. Men who had once laughed at Bjarnolf's choice now watched Ragnar with calculating eyes, their wives whispering behind their hands whenever she passed. "They're talking about us," Astrid confided as they worked together in the herb garden, preparing the final harvest of medicinal plants before winter's grip made gathering impossible. "Mother Helga says some of the women think you've bewitched the master." Ragnar's hands stilled on the bundle of yarrow she'd been tying. "Bewitched him how?" They say it's unnatural for a warrior like him to keep an old woman when he could have any young beauty in 3 kingdoms. They whisper that you must have used dark magic to cloud his judgment. The accusation was both predictable and dangerous. In a world where unexplained events were often attributed to supernatural causes, a woman who possessed healing knowledge could easily be viewed with suspicion, especially a woman whose presence couldn't be explained by the usual motivations men were assumed to have. "And what do you think?" Ragnar asked quietly. Astrid's young face showed fierce loyalty. "I think they're jealous fools. You've helped more people in 2 months than they've helped in their whole lives. If that's witchcraft, then we need more witches." Despite the girl's staunch defense, Ragnar could feel the weight of community scrutiny settling around the homestead like morning fog. It showed in the way conversations stopped when she entered the market, in the suspicious glances directed toward the herb garden, in the careful distance other women now maintained when they brought their families for treatment. More concerning was the change she sensed in Bjarnulf himself. The easy companionship they'd developed was increasingly interrupted by long absences and tense conversations with visitors who arrived after dark. She recognized the signs. Political tensions were rising, and a man of his reputation couldn't avoid being drawn into whatever conflicts were brewing. The nature of those conflicts became clearer when Sven Bloodaxe arrived one grey morning with a party of armed retainers. Ragnar had heard the name whispered in frightened tones, a young jarl whose ambitions were matched only by his cruelty. He ruled the northern fjords through fear and violence, and his presence at any peaceful homestead was cause for concern. She watched from the kitchen window as Bjarnulf greeted his unwelcome guest with the courtesy demanded by hospitality laws, though his posture remained rigid with tension. Even at a distance, Sven's aggressive energy was palpable. The way he gestured broadly, the harsh laughter that carried across the yard, the casual hand that rested on his sword hilt, as if violence were always his first consideration. When Helga brought ale and food to the men, Ragnar caught fragments of their conversation through the open door. Words like alliance and tribute and consequences for those who refuse to choose sides. It was the language of brewing war, and she felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "That one brings nothing but trouble," Helga muttered when she returned to the kitchen. "Mark my words, no good will come of his visit." As if to prove the cook's prophecy, their conversation was interrupted by raised voices from the hall. Through the window, Ragnar could see Sven gesturing angrily, while Bjarnulf stood with arms crossed, his massive frame radiating the controlled violence that had made him legendary. "You forget yourself, Bjarnulf." Sven's voice carried clearly in the crisp air. "The old ways are passing. Kings and jarls who refuse to adapt will find themselves swept aside by those who understand the changing tide. And what tide is that?" Bjarnulf's response was dangerously quiet. "The tide that favors the bold over the cautious, the strong over the sentimental. I've heard interesting stories about you lately, my friend. Stories about how the great giant has gone soft, keeping house with an old woman when he should be planning conquests." The insult hung in the air like the scent of smoke before a fire. Ragnar felt her heart clench with fear, not for herself, but for what Bjarnulf might do in response. She'd seen enough warriors to know that challenges to their reputation could provoke reactions that destroyed everything they'd built. But Bjarnulf's reply, when it came, was measured and calm. "I keep my own house as I see fit. What concern is that of yours? It becomes my concern when it affects your usefulness as an ally." Men are beginning to question whether Bjarnulf the giant still exists, or whether he's been replaced by a tame housecat who spends his time watching an old woman tend flowers. The deliberate provocations continued for another hour, with Sven pushing and probing for weakness, while Bjarnulf maintained his careful control. But Ragnar could see the cost of that restraint in the tight set of his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands, when he thought no one was watching. After Sven and his men finally departed, taking their threats and ultimatums with them, Bjarnulf disappeared into the weapons room where he kept his father's great war axe mounted on the wall. The artifact was a masterwork of deadly craftsmanship, its iron head inlaid with silver runes, and its ash handle worn smooth by generations of warrior hands. It represented everything about his heritage that he'd been trying to move beyond, the cycle of violence and conquest that had defined his family for centuries. Ragnar found him there as evening shadows lengthened, standing before the axe with the expression of a man confronting his own nature. "He's trying to provoke you into making a mistake," she said quietly. "I know what he's doing." Bjarnulf's voice carried the weight of years spent navigating the deadly politics of warrior culture. "The question is whether I can continue to resist." "Idu, why would you want to resist it? You are who you are. Your reputation was earned through strength and victory." He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw a pain that went deeper than any physical wound. Because that reputation was built on the bones of men who probably had families who loved them. Because every victory song sung about my deeds represents someone else's tragedy. Because I'm tired of being the monster in other people's nightmares. The admission hung between them, like a bridge neither had expected to cross. In that moment, Ragnar understood something that the community gossips and ambitious rivals couldn't grasp. Bjarnulf's protection of her wasn't weakness, but the desperate act of a man trying to prove to himself that he could choose gentleness over violence. "Sven is right about one thing," she said carefully. "The world is changing, but perhaps it's changing in ways that favor wisdom over brutality, healing over harming. Perhaps your choice to value an old woman's knowledge over a young warrior's sword is exactly the kind of strength this new world needs." As they stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the weapons of his violent past, Ragnar realized they had both reached a crossroads. The peaceful interlude of her healing work and his gentle protection was ending. Challenged by forces that demanded they choose between the safety of conformity and the dangerous path of their own convictions. Whatever came next would test not only their individual courage, but the bond they'd forged between the man who'd learned that strength could serve compassion and the woman who'd discovered that her greatest battles might still lie ahead. Winter's approach brought with it a deepening of the memories that had begun to surface since that night in the herb garden. The long evenings by the fire, when the household gathered for stories and ale, became opportunities for Ragnar and Bjarnulf to share the fragments of their past that had shaped them into the people they'd become. It was during one such evening, when most of the others had retired to their beds and only the dying embers provided light, that Bjarnulf disappeared briefly and returned carrying something wrapped in soft leather. With careful hands, he unwrapped a small wooden cup, crude and uneven, but carved with obvious care. Ragnar's breath caught in her throat. She recognized it immediately. The cup he'd made for her all those years ago, the gift left on her table, along with wildflowers before he'd vanished into the morning mist. "You kept it," she whispered, reaching out to touch the familiar wood. "All these years." "It was the first thing I ever made with my own hands that wasn't a weapon," he said quietly. "The first gift I ever gave out of gratitude rather than obligation or strategy. Even when I had nothing else, I carried it with me." She lifted the cup, feeling the slight roughness where young, unpracticed hands had worked the wood. It was perhaps the most precious thing she'd ever held, not for its material value, which was negligible, but for what it represented. An act of pure thankfulness from a boy who'd had nothing to give except his effort and intention. "Tell me what happened after you left," she said. "How did that frightened child become the warrior whose name is spoken across kingdoms?" The story that emerged over the following nights was both heartbreaking and inspiring. After leaving her, Care, the young Bjarnulf, had wandered for months, surviving on scraps and charity when he could find it, growing stronger and more determined with each passing day. He'd eventually found his way to the court of Jarl Eriksson, where his size and desperate hunger to prove himself had earned him a place among the warrior trainees. "I threw myself into every lesson, every challenge, every opportunity to demonstrate. Worth, he explained as they sat together in the quiet hall. I learned weapons, tactics, leadership, but mostly I learned that strength could protect the things I valued. I never wanted to feel helpless again the way I did the night my family died. His rise through the ranks had been meteoric, fueled by natural talent, relentless training, and a warrior's fury that made him formidable in battle. But with each victory came new expectations, greater challenges, more violence required to maintain his growing reputation. When did you realize that strength alone wasn't enough? Ragnar asked, sensing the deeper currents in his story. The first time I won a battle and realized I felt no joy in it, just emptiness, as if I'd been feeding a hunger that could never be satisfied. He stared into the fire, his face reflecting years of carried burdens. I'd become everything I thought I needed to be, but I'd lost track of why I wanted to become it in the first place. In return, Ragnar shared her own story, not just the practical details of her fall from grace, but the deeper truths about what it meant to build a life around caring for others and then watch that life crumble through circumstances beyond her control. She'd been barely 17 when she married Gunnar, a prosperous farmer whose first wife had died in childbirth. It was a practical match that had grown into genuine affection, and their life together had been blessed with abundance and purpose. She'd borne 3 children, learned healing from the old woman who served their village, and built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with both secrets and suffering. I thought I understood how the world worked, she admitted. I believed that if you were useful, if you contributed to your community, if you lived with honor and kindness, then you'd be valued and protected. It took me far too long to learn that women's security rests entirely on the goodwill of men who may not always choose to extend it. The deaths had come gradually. First her youngest daughter to fever, then her eldest son in a raid. Finally, her husband to a winter sickness that had defeated all her healing knowledge. With each loss, her position in the community had weakened. A woman alone, even one with valuable skills, was seen as a burden rather than an asset. My surviving son saw me as a relic of his father's generation, something that reminded him of responsibilities he didn't want to carry. When his gambling debts mounted and he needed quick silver, selling his aging mother seemed like a reasonable solution. The pain in her voice was matched by the anger in Bjarnolf's eyes. He had no right, no honor. A man who would sell his own mother deserves to live with the consequences of his choices. Ragnar interrupted gently. Anger won't change what happened, and revenge won't restore what was lost. Sometimes the only justice we can find is in refusing to let bitterness poison whatever good remains in our lives. As the nights grew longer and their conversations deeper, both began to understand how their separate journeys had prepared them for this unlikely reunion. Bjarnolf struggled to move beyond the cycle of violence that had defined his identity. Ragnar's determination to maintain dignity despite society's dismissal. Both were wrestling with questions of worth and purpose that transcended their individual circumstances. The household, meanwhile, had begun to reflect their influence in subtle but meaningful ways. Disputes were settled through discussion rather than force. Magnus, fully recovered from his broken leg, had taken to mediating arguments among the younger workers with wisdom beyond his years. Astrid's growing knowledge of healing arts was making her increasingly confident and valuable to the community. Even Thorstein, whose decades of service had made him cautious about changes to established routines, had begun incorporating Ragnar's suggestions about everything from food preservation to livestock care. The homestead was becoming something new, not just a warrior's hall where strength was the primary currency, but a place where different kinds of knowledge were valued and different forms of wisdom were respected. But their growing closeness and the visible changes in the household's character were not going unnoticed by the outside world. Word was spreading that Bjarnulf the giant had indeed grown soft, that his legendary fierceness was being diluted by the influence of an aging woman who placed healing above harming. The whispers were becoming bolder, the challenges more direct. Other warriors were beginning to test boundaries that had once been sacred, probing for weaknesses in a reputation built on uncompromising strength. And behind it all, the shadow of Sven Bloodaxe loomed larger, his agents carrying messages that painted Bjarnulf's new lifestyle as both weakness and opportunity. One evening, as they sat beside the fire with the wooden cup between them on the table, a bridge across 4 decades of separation and struggle, Ragnar voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart. "They won't let us continue as we are," she said quietly. "The world doesn't have room for warriors who choose compassion or women who refuse to accept their assigned place. Something will force us to choose between safety and authenticity." Bjarnulf reached across the table and covered her weathered hand with his massive one. "Then we'll choose authentically and face whatever comes. I spent too many years being what others expected me to be. I won't go back to that, no matter the cost." As the fire burned low and shadows gathered in the corners of the hall, both knew that their peaceful interlude was drawing to a close. The forces gathering around them would soon demand answers to questions they weren't ready to face. But for this moment, they had each other, and the precious understanding that some connections transcend time, circumstance, and the cruel judgments of a world that too often mistakes gentleness for weakness. The messenger arrived on a morning when frost painted the windows silver and the first real snow of winter lay thick on the ground. He was young, barely past boyhood, but he bore the seal of King Harald himself, a detail that made even Bjarnulf's weathered features tighten with concern as he broke the royal wax. Ragnar watched from across the hall as her protector read the parchment, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock to something that might have been fear. When he looked up at her, she saw in his eyes the reflection of a world about to change in ways neither of them had anticipated. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Without speaking, Bjarnulf handed her the scroll. The formal language of royal decree swam before her eyes, but certain phrases leapt out like brands. "Hereby summoned to answer charges," and "illegal possession of royal property," and most chilling of all, "the noble woman known as Ragna Eriksdottir." Her hands began to shake as the full meaning penetrated her consciousness. Someone knew who she really was, or rather, who she had been before her world collapsed. Someone had connected the aging slave woman in Bjarnulf's household with the dispossessed daughter of Jarl Erik the Wise, whose lands and titles had been stripped away by political maneuvering and false accusations of treason. "This isn't possible," she whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. "I've been so careful. I haven't used that name in years." "Explain," Bjarnulf commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a military leader facing a crisis. "What is this about royal property? What noble birth?" The story that spilled out of her was one she'd buried so deeply that speaking it aloud felt like excavating her own grave. She had indeed been born to nobility, daughter of Jarl Erik, whose wisdom and fair judgment had made him beloved by his people but dangerous to those with crueler ambitions. Her childhood had been spent in halls where skalds sang and diplomats negotiated, where decisions affected the lives of thousands, and where she'd learned to read and write in multiple languages. "My father ruled the eastern fjords justly for 30 years, she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. He settled disputes through law rather than warfare, protected the weak, encouraged trade that enriched all his people. But such methods made enemies among those who preferred the old ways of taking what they wanted through strength alone. The conspiracy against her family had been masterfully orchestrated. False evidence of communications with Danish raiders, forged documents suggesting treasonous alliances, testimony bought with gold and threats. By the time Erik realized the depth of the plot against him, It was too late. His lands were seized, his household scattered, his family declared outlaws. They killed my father during his escape attempt, Ragnar continued, the old pain still sharp despite the decades. My brothers died fighting to reach safety that never came. I survived only because I was already married and living under my husband's protection in a distant village. But even there, I couldn't use my birth name without risking discovery. Bjarnulf's face had grown stone hard as the story unfolded. Who orchestrated this betrayal? A coalition led by Jarl Magnus the Black and his allies. Men who wanted my father's fertile lands and strategic harbors, who saw his peaceful methods as weakness to be exploited. She looked down at the royal summons, still clutched in her trembling hands. But Magnus died in battle 5 years ago. Someone else has taken up his vendetta. Sven Bloodaxe, Bjarnulf said grimly. Magnus was his uncle. The lands your family once held are now part of his domain. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Sven's recent visit, his pointed comments about Bjarnulf's changing reputation, his obvious interest in anything that might provide leverage over potential rivals, it all made sense now. Somehow, through spies or informants or simple bad luck, he'd discovered that the woman living under Bjarnulf's protection was the last surviving member of a family that had once controlled territory he now claimed as his own. By harboring me, you've made yourself complicit in harboring a fugitive from royal justice, Ragnar said, her voice heavy with guilt and fear. I've brought this danger to your household without even knowing it. You brought nothing but healing and wisdom to this house, Bjarnulf replied fiercely. Whatever political games are being played around your identity, they don't change what you've become to us. But even as he spoke those loyal words, both of them understood the gravity of the situation. In the harsh legal framework of their society, unknowingly harboring an outlaw noble was still a crime that could result in the forfeiture of lands, property, and life itself. The royal summons demanded both their appearances at court within a fortnight, Ragnar to answer charges related to her assumed identity, Bjarnulf to explain how he'd come to possess royal property without proper authorization. As the day progressed, and word of the summons spread through the household, the atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken fears. Thorstein's weathered face showed the concern of a man who'd seen households destroyed by political entanglements beyond their control. Helga muttered prayers to various gods while she worked, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind wrestled with uncertainty. Young Astrid looked between Ragnar and Bjarnulf, with the wide-eyed confusion of someone too young to understand the complexities of noble politics, but old enough to sense impending disaster. That evening, as they sat in the great hall surrounded by the familiar comfort of home that now felt fragile as spun glass, Ragnar made a decision that had been forming in her heart since the messenger's arrival. I have to leave, she announced quietly, tonight before this spreads further. If I disappear, you can claim ignorance of my true identity. Say you purchased a slave woman in good faith and had no knowledge of her background. Absolutely not. Bjarnulf's response was immediate and final. Running would only confirm guilt and leave you defenseless against whatever charges they're preparing. We face this together, or not at all. You don't understand the forces arrayed against us. Sven has been planning this, gathering evidence, building a case that will destroy everything you've worked to build here. Your people, your lands, your life, all of it is at risk because of me. My life has been at risk from the moment I chose to value compassion over conquest. If standing by you brings consequences, then we'll face those consequences with honor intact. From her place beside the fire, Ragnar studied the face of the man who'd grown from the boy she'd once saved. In his features, she could still see traces of that frightened child, but they were overlaid now with the strength and determination that had made him legendary. He'd spent decades learning that true power came not from inspiring fear, but from protecting what mattered most. There's something else, she said softly, reaching beneath her dress to withdraw the small silver pendant she'd worn hidden for so long. something that proves my identity beyond any doubt. The Thor's hammer pendant glinted in the firelight. But now Bjarnulf could see what had been hidden from casual observation. Tiny runes worked into the silver, spelling out her true name and lineage. It was a piece of royal jewelry, unmistakably crafted for a noble house, and impossible to explain away as coincidence. This belonged to my grandmother and her grandmother before her. It's been passed down through 7 generations of Jarl's daughters. No common woman could possess such a thing, and no forger could replicate the specific runes and craftsmanship. She pressed the pendant into his large palm. If they take me, destroy it. Don't let it become evidence in their case against you. But Bjarnulf closed her fingers around the pendant instead, his hands completely enveloping hers. We're not going to run, and we're not going to destroy evidence of who you are. Instead, we're going to do something that political schemers never expect. We're going to tell the complete truth and let it stand as our defense. As snow continued to fall outside the windows and the fire burned lower in the hearth, Ragnar felt the last vestiges of her hidden identity dissolving like frost in sunlight. After decades of careful concealment, of burying her noble birth beneath the practical concerns of survival, she was about to step back into the dangerous light of political attention. The woman who had been Ragna Eriksdottir, daughter of Jarls, and heir to ancient bloodlines, was about to reclaim her true name and all the deadly consequences that came with it. The question now was whether the man who'd chosen to protect her would survive the storm that her revelation was about to unleash upon them both. The days following the royal summons passed with the strange intensity of a calm before battle. Everyone in the household understood that their peaceful world was about to be shattered, but the form that destruction would take remained uncertain. Would they face a formal trial at the king's court? Would Sven Bloodaxe arrive with armed men to claim his prize? Would the very foundations of everything Bjarnulf had built be swept away by forces beyond their control? Bjarnulf threw himself into preparations with the methodical thoroughness that had made him legendary as a military strategist. He sent messages to old allies, called in favors accumulated over decades of warfare, and began assembling evidence that might counter whatever charges were being prepared against them. But beneath his tactical planning, Ragnar could see the deeper struggle, a man being forced to choose between the violent solutions that had always served him and the gentler path he'd been trying to walk. On the 3rd morning after the messenger's visit, as she worked in her herb garden gathering the last useful plants before winter claimed them completely, she found him standing beside his father's war axe once again. The ancient weapon seemed to draw him like a lodestone, representing everything he'd inherited from generations of warriors who'd solved their problems through strength and steel. It would be simpler, he said without preamble, knowing she would. Understand his meaning. Sven has perhaps 30 men in his warband. I could gather twice that number. Veterans who fought beside me, who would answer my call without question. We could end this threat before it reaches the king's court. And afterward, Ragnar asked, continuing to harvest the last of her healing herbs. After you've proven that the great Bjarnulf still knows how to solve problems with violence? What, then? Then we'd be free to live as we choose, without political games or ancient grudges threatening everything we've built here. She straightened from her work, studying his face with the careful attention she'd once given to diagnosing illness. Would we? Or would we simply be back where you started, surrounded by people who respect your capacity for destruction but who could never trust the gentleness that makes you worth knowing? The question hung between them like mist, and she could see him wrestling with truths he'd been avoiding. The path of violence was familiar, comfortable in its predictability, but it was also the path that had left him feeling empty after each victory, disconnected from everything he'd thought he was fighting to protect. That afternoon brought unexpected visitors, not enemies with threats or demands, but friends offering support in forms both practical and profound. Magnus arrived with his wife and two young sons, declaring his intention to speak on behalf of the woman who'd saved his leg and possibly his life. Olaf the Stout came with testimony about Ragnar's healing of his boy, ready to swear before King, and court that her skills had proven invaluable to the community. Even Eric Longbeard, who'd been among those laughing at Bjarnulf's choice at the slave market, appeared at their door with a formal apology and an offer to stand witness to Ragnar's character and contributions. "I spoke without wisdom that day," he admitted, his weathered face showing genuine remorse. "I saw only what I expected to see, an aging woman past her useful years. I didn't see the healer, the teacher, the woman whose knowledge has helped half the families in this district. If the court needs testimony about her worth, they'll have it from me." As the household filled with supporters preparing to make the journey to the royal court, Ragnar found herself moved by demonstrations of loyalty she hadn't expected. These were practical people who valued results over rhetoric, and the results of her presence in their community had been measurable. Fewer deaths in childbirth, faster healing from injuries, children who survived illnesses that might once have claimed them. But the most significant support came from an unexpected source. Late on the fourth evening, as snow fell steadily outside and the hall buzzed with quiet conversations about travel preparations and legal strategies, Thorstein approached with something wrapped in oiled cloth. "The master told me about your true identity," the old steward said quietly, "about who your father was and what was done to your family. There's something you should see." With careful hands, he unwrapped a pair of simple iron rings, their surfaces darkened with age, but still bearing the intertwined knotwork that marked them as wedding bands. But these weren't ordinary rings. Ragnar could see immediately that they'd been forged by a master craftsman, their design speaking of ancient traditions and sacred commitments. "These belonged to Bjarnulf's grandparents," Thorstein explained. "They were among the first settlers in this valley, back when your father was a young jarl learning to rule with justice rather than fear. These rings represent a bond that lasted 60 years, through good harvests and bad, through raids and peace, through all the changes that time brings to those who choose to face them together." The implication was clear, though Thorstein was too tactful to state it directly. In the uncertain days ahead, when their very survival might depend on presenting a united front against their enemies, the difference between a warrior protecting his slave woman and a man defending his chosen partner could determine the outcome of everything they faced. "The master hasn't spoken of this directly," Thorstein continued, "but I've seen how he looks at you, how you look at each other. These rings have been waiting for the right moment, the right purpose. Perhaps that time has come." That evening, as the household settled into uneasy sleep and the fire burned low in the great hearth, Bjarnulf found her sitting beside the dying embers with the iron rings resting in her open palm. "Thorstein showed you his suggestion," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "He did, along with his assessment of our situation and what steps might strengthen our position before the court." She looked up at him, seeing in his face the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that she felt in her own heart. "Is that what this would be? A strategic alliance for mutual protection?" "It could be that," he replied carefully. "Marriage would give you legal standing that slavery cannot provide. As my wife, you'd have rights that could complicate Sven's plans considerably. And that's the only reason you'd consider such a step?" In the firelight, his smile was both tender and rueful. "You know better than that. You've known better since the night I first saw you at that market and realized that fate had given me a second chance to protect someone who'd once protected me." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that they stood at a crossroads that would determine not just their legal strategy, but the entire shape of their future together. The rings in her palm seemed to grow warmer, as if they carried some ember of the love that had sustained his grandparents through 6 decades of shared challenges. "There's something else," Ragnar said softly. Something I haven't told you about. My past, about what my father taught me regarding the old laws and noble rights. She explained then about the ancient legal traditions that even kings were bound to respect. Laws that protected the rights of dispossessed nobility to reclaim their hereditary positions if they could prove their legitimacy and demonstrate their worthiness to rule. It was an obscure legal principle, rarely invoked and even more rarely successful, but it existed nonetheless. If I were to appear before the court not as a runaway slave, but as the daughter of Jarl Erik, rightful heir to the eastern fjords that Sven now illegally controls, if I could prove my identity and my worthiness, then the entire nature of this confrontation changes. Bjarnulf's eyes sharpened with understanding. Instead of defending against charges of harboring a fugitive, we'd be asserting a legitimate claim to lands and titles. Instead of being on trial, we'd be the ones bringing accusations. It's dangerous, she warned. If the attempt fails, if we can't prove our case, or if the political forces against us are too strong, then we'd face not just loss of property, but execution for treason. The stakes would be absolute. They already are absolute, he replied. Sven won't stop with this one attempt. If we don't end this confrontation decisively, he'll keep coming with new schemes and greater threats until he destroys everything we value. As the night deepened and the snow continued to fall outside, they made their plans with the careful attention to detail that had sustained them both through decades of survival. They would travel to court not as supplicants begging for mercy, but as legitimate claimants demanding justice. They would present not just Ragnar's noble birth, but her worthiness to reclaim her father's legacy, demonstrated through years of service to her community and supported by the testimony of those whose lives she'd touched. And they would do it together, bound not just by strategic necessity, but by the deeper commitment represented by the ancient rings that seemed to hold the warmth of enduring love, even in the depths of winter's cold. When dawn came, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, they would begin the journey that would either restore Ragnar to her rightful place in the world or see them both destroyed by the forces arrayed against them. But for this last night in the home they'd built together, they allowed themselves to hope that love and justice might prove stronger than ambition and cruelty. The rings remained warm in Ragnar's palm, tangible symbols of a commitment that transcended the political calculations threatening to tear their world apart. Whatever the outcome of the trials ahead, they would face them not as warrior and slave, but as partners who'd chosen each other across the vast distances of time, circumstance, and social expectation. Tomorrow would bring the final test of whether the gentler path they'd chosen together could survive in a world that too often rewarded only strength and ruthlessness. The royal court at Uppsala was a place where power wore many faces, but all of them were carved from the same unforgiving stone. As Ragnar and Bjarnulf approached the great hall where King Harald held court, surrounded by their supporters and carrying the weight of generations on their shoulders, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with moments when everything hung in the balance. The hall itself was a monument to royal authority. Massive timber beams soared overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast, while tapestries depicting the king's victories covered walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of ambitious men for decades. At the far end, on a throne carved from a single piece of oak and inlaid with precious metals, sat the king whose word could restore her heritage or condemn them both to death. King Harald was older than Ragnar remembered from her youth. His golden hair now streaked with silver, and his face bearing the lines of a man who'd made countless hard decisions. But his pale blue eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him both feared and respected across the northern kingdoms. Those eyes fixed on their party with the calculating attention of a predator evaluating potential threats. Sven. Bloodaxe stood at the king's right hand, his presence there a clear indication of the political groundwork he'd already laid. His cruel smile as they entered suggested a man who believed the outcome had already been determined in his favor. Around him clustered his supporters, jarls and wealthy merchants who'd profited from his harsh rule of the eastern fjords, men who had every reason to see Ragnar's claims dismissed and her supporters punished, but their own party was not without strength. Magnus walked beside her, still favoring the leg she'd healed, but carrying himself with the dignity of a man testifying to truth. Olaf the Stout had brought not just himself, but 3 other fathers whose children owed their lives to her healing skills. Eric Longbeard's presence alone spoke volumes about the respect she'd earned in her community, and beside her, Bjarnulf moved with the controlled power that had made him legendary, his massive frame serving as both protection and statement of intent. On his finger, the simple iron band caught the light from the hall's great fire, a public declaration of their bond that changed the entire legal framework of their situation. When the royal herald called them forward, Ragnar felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. But her voice, when she spoke, carried the clear authority of a woman who'd found her courage in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Your Majesty," she began, her words carrying across the silent hall, "I come before you not as a supplicant begging mercy, but as Ragnar Eriksdottir, daughter of Jarl Erik the Wise, rightful heir to the eastern fjords that were stolen from my family through treachery and lies." The murmur that rippled through the assembled nobles was like wind through grain fields, a sound that spoke of shifting loyalties and changing calculations. Sven's confident smile faltered slightly as he realized she was not going to play the role of defeated fugitive he'd prepared his case around. From the leather pouch at her waist, she withdrew the silver brooch that had belonged to her mother, not the simple Thor's hammer pendant she'd shown Bjarnulf, but a piece of royal jewelry that had been hidden even deeper, wrapped in cloth and buried beneath her other meager possessions. This brooch bore the unmistakable heraldry of her father's house, intricate knotwork surrounding the raven and ship that had marked their family's standard for generations. "This belonged to my mother, Astrid Eriksdottir, and to her mother before her. It bears the seal that your own father recognized when he confirmed my family's right to rule the eastern settlements." She held the brooch high, letting its silver catch the firelight. No thief could possess such a thing. No forgery could replicate the craftsmanship of the royal smiths who made it. King Harald leaned forward on his throne, his expression shifting from bored authority to genuine interest. "If you are indeed who you claim to be, then you stand accused of far more than simple fugitive status. Your family was branded traitor to the crown. Their lands were forfeit, their bloodline declared cursed. My family was betrayed by ambitious men who used lies and forgeries to steal what they could not take by right," Ragnar replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I come before you now not to beg restoration of what was taken, but to prove that the charges against us were false from the beginning." She gestured to the men and women who traveled with her to court. "These people will testify to my character, to the healing I've brought to their families, to the wisdom I've shared with their communities. Is this the behavior of a traitor's daughter? Is this the fruit of a cursed bloodline?" One by one, Magnus and the others stepped forward to offer their testimony. They spoke of broken bones healed and fevers broken, of children saved from illnesses that would once have claimed them, of a woman who'd asked nothing for herself while giving everything to those in need. Sven's face had darkened with growing anger as he realized his carefully prepared case was being dismantled before his eyes. When the testimonies concluded, he stepped forward with the aggressive energy of a man whose patience had reached its limit. "Your Majesty," he declared, his voice carrying across the hall with practiced authority, "we cannot allow sentiment to cloud our judgment in matters of law and royal justice. Whatever healing skills this woman may possess, whatever testimony her supporters may offer, the fact remains that she is the daughter of proven traitors. Blood will tell, and traitorous blood cannot be cleansed by good deeds." The challenge was direct and dangerous, forcing the king to choose between the evidence of Ragnar's worthiness and the political convenience of supporting Sven's claims to her family's lands. In the tense silence that followed, she could feel the weight of history pressing down upon them all. The ghosts of her murdered family, the dreams of justice too long delayed, the hope that truth might finally prove stronger than ambition. The silence that followed Sven's challenge stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap. King Harald's weathered fingers drummed against the arm of his throne, the sound echoing in the vast hall like distant thunder. His pale eyes moved between Ragnar and Sven, weighing not just their competing claims, but the political implications of whatever decision he rendered. It was Bjarnulf who broke the silence, stepping forward with the measured grace of a man who'd commanded armies and knew the value of choosing his moments carefully. "Your Majesty," he said, his deep voice carrying the authority of earned reputation, "if I may speak to the question of bloodlines and their true nature." The king's nod was barely perceptible, but it was permission enough. Sven Bloodaxe speaks of tainted blood as if character were determined by ancestry alone. Yet he himself is nephew to Magnus the Black, whose cruelty and greed were legendary even among those who profited from his reign. If blood determines destiny, what does that say of the man who inherited Magnus's lands and methods? A murmur ran through the assembled nobles, some nodding thoughtfully at the point while others shifted uncomfortably. Bjarnulf pressed his advantage. "I have known this woman not as nobility hiding her identity, but as a healer who asked nothing for herself while serving others. When a young man broke his leg in my household, she set it with skills that saved him from permanent lameness. When children fell sick with lung fever, she traveled through winter storms to bring them healing. When the old suffered with joint pain that made their final years a torment, she eased their suffering without thought of reward." He paused, letting his words settle in the minds of men who understood the practical value of such service. This is the fruit of the bloodline Sven would condemn as cursed, not conquest or accumulation, but healing and wisdom freely given. If this woman is indeed the daughter of Eric the Wise, then she has proven herself worthy of that heritage through her actions, not despite her bloodline. King Harald's attention had sharpened during Bjarnulf's speech, his calculating gaze now focused on Ragnar with new interest. "You claim that the charges against your family were fabricated. Can you prove this?" From within her cloak, Ragnar withdrew a scroll that few in the hall had expected to see. A document bearing the seal of Magnus the Black himself, yellow with age, but still legible. The parchment trembled slightly in her hands as she unrolled. This letter was written by Magnus to his lieutenant, discussing the fabrication of evidence against my father. It speaks of forged documents, bribed witnesses, and the systematic destruction of proof that would have vindicated our family. Her voice grew stronger as she read the damning passages aloud. "It was hidden among papers my husband rescued from our burning home, kept secret all these years, because speaking it would have meant death for anyone who possessed it." The revelation hit the court like a physical blow. Even Sven's supporters seemed stunned by the existence of such direct evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed one of the kingdom's most respected noble houses. Sven himself had gone pale, his confident demeanor cracking as he realized the trap the decades-old treachery had set for him. "That document is clearly a forgery," he declared, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. "Desperate people will create any evidence to support their false claims." But King Harald was already gesturing to his senior advisor, a grey-bearded man whose expertise in ancient documents and seals was renowned throughout the kingdom. The old scholar examined the parchment with the careful attention of someone whose word could determine life or death, studying not just the content but the ink, the parchment, the impression of the seal. After what felt like an eternity, the advisor looked up at his king. "The document is genuine, Your Majesty. The seal, the script, the materials, all are consistent with Magnus the Black's correspondence from that." Period. Moreover, the specific details mentioned align with other evidence that has come to light over the years. The transformation in the hall was immediate and dramatic. Nobles who had seemed prepared to support Sven's claims suddenly found themselves reconsidering their positions. The king himself sat back in his throne, his expression thoughtful as he processed the implications of this revelation. From beneath his leather vest, Bjarnulf withdrew a simple stone, not precious or ornate, but carved with ancient runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. This was an oath stone, one of the sacred artifacts used in the most solemn ceremonies of their people. "Your Majesty," he said, placing the stone on the floor before the throne, "I would swear upon this sacred stone that everything we have claimed here is truth. Moreover, I would swear to support Ragnar Eriksdottir's rightful claim to her father's lands and titles, not as her protector or benefactor, but as her chosen partner and husband." The oath sworn upon such a stone was unbreakable in the eyes of gods and men. To lie while touching it would bring curses that could destroy not just the liar, but entire bloodlines. As Bjarnulf knelt and placed his hand upon the carved surface, every person in the hall understood the absolute nature of his commitment. Ragnar joined him there, her smaller hand covering his upon the ancient stone. "I swear by the gods of our fathers and the honor of my bloodline that I am Ragnar Eriksdottir, rightful heir to the eastern fjords, and that everything we have testified here is true." The power of that moment seemed to fill the great hall with something approaching the sacred. Even King Harald appeared moved by the solemnity of oaths sworn on stones that had witnessed such ceremonies for centuries beyond counting. When they rose from the oath stone, it was as vindicated claimants rather than desperate supplicants. The evidence of treachery, the testimony of worthiness, and the sacred nature of their oaths had shifted the entire balance of the proceeding. Sven Bloodaxe found himself no longer the accuser, but the accused, his illegal possession of lands rightfully belonging to another now exposed for all to see. The political calculations that had seemed so favorable to him moments before had crumbled beneath the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Spring came early to the eastern fjords that year, as if the land itself rejoiced in the restoration of rightful rule. From the great hall that had once belonged to her father, now rebuilt and expanded under her guidance, Ragnar could see the harbour where merchant ships arrived daily, their holds full of goods for trade rather than the tribute that Sven's harsh rule had demanded. 6 months had passed since that pivotal day at the royal court when truth had finally proven stronger than ambition. King Harald's judgment had been swift and decisive once the evidence of treachery came to light. Sven Bloodaxe had been stripped of his unlawfully held lands and exiled beyond the kingdom's borders, his supporters scattered like leaves before an autumn wind. More importantly, Ragnar Eriksdottir had been formally recognized as the rightful heir to her father's legacy, her noble status restored, along with all the lands and titles that had been stolen from her family. But the greatest victory wasn't measured in acres restored or political enemies defeated. It was visible in the thriving garden that stretched beyond the hall's walls. Not just the herb garden she tended with her own hands, but the metaphorical garden of a community learning to flourish under leadership that valued wisdom alongside strength. The physical garden itself had become something of a wonder, attracting visitors from distant settlements who came to learn from the woman whose healing knowledge had saved so many lives. Neat rows of medicinal plants grew beside vegetables and flowers, creating a tapestry of colors and scents that changed with the seasons. At its heart stood a small stone bench where Ragnar often sat in the evenings, teaching the next generation of healers the secrets that had taken her decades to master. Astrid, now bearing the formal title of apprentice healer, moved among the plants with the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling. The shy kitchen girl had blossomed into a young woman whose healing skills were already becoming known throughout the region. Watching her work, Ragnar felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing her knowledge would outlive her, passed down to hands that would carry it forward with the same dedication she'd once learned from the old woman who'd been her own teacher. "She's going to surpass us both," Bjarnulf observed, joining her on the garden path as the sun set behind the mountains that ringed their valley. After 6 months of marriage, he still moved with the controlled power that had made him legendary as a warrior, but now that strength served gentler purposes, building rather than destroying, protecting rather than conquering. "That's as it should be," Ragnar replied, accepting the cup of honey mead he offered her. "Each generation should build upon the knowledge of those who came before. She's already discovered 2 plant combinations I never tried, and her way with frightened children is better than mine ever was." They walked together through their domain as the evening settled around them, noting with satisfaction the signs of prosperity and contentment that marked their stewardship. The fields were green with healthy crops, the livestock fat and content. In their pastures, more importantly, the people they encountered, farmers bringing in the day's work, children playing games in the long twilight, craftsmen cleaning their tools after productive days, showed the relaxed confidence of those who lived without fear of arbitrary cruelty or sudden demands for tribute they couldn't afford. In the great hall, the evening meal was a celebration of abundance shared freely rather than wealth hoarded jealously. The long tables accommodated not just their household, but any travelers who'd arrived during the day, following the ancient tradition of hospitality that Eric the Wise had practiced and his daughter had restored. Conversations flowed as freely as the ale, covering everything from the best techniques for preserving winter food to the latest news from neighboring settlements. Magnus, fully recovered from his injury and now serving as their chief steward, stood to offer the evening's toast. "To Our Lady Ragnar and Lord Bjarnulf," he said, raising his cup high, "who showed us that true strength lies not in taking what we want, but in nurturing what we have." The responding cheer echoed off the hall's rafters, carrying with it the genuine affection of people whose lives had been immeasurably improved by the choices their leaders had made. As the evening progressed and stories were shared around the great fire, Ragnar reflected on the journey that had brought her from that humiliating auction to this moment of quiet triumph. Later, as the household settled into peaceful sleep and only the dying embers provided light, she and Bjarnulf sat in comfortable silence beside the fire that had warmed so many similar evenings. On the table between them sat the wooden cup he'd carved for her as a boy, now one of their most treasured possessions, a reminder of how far they'd both traveled and how much they'd learned about the nature of true worth. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been at that market?" she asked, tracing the cup's rough edges with her finger. "Every day," he replied, "but not with regret. Sometimes the threads of fate weave together in patterns too complex for us to understand until we step back and see the completed tapestry. Your son's betrayal, my presence at the auction, even Sven's attempt to destroy us, all of it led to this moment, this place, this life we've built together." Through the windows, moonlight illuminated the peaceful settlement that had grown up. Around their hall, homes for families who'd found prosperity under their protection, workshops for craftsmen who plied their trades without fear of arbitrary seizure, gardens where children learned to tend growing things with the same care they'd been shown. "I used to think my story ended the day I was sold at that market," Ragnar said softly. "I thought I was witnessing the final chapter of a life that had lost all its meaning and purpose. Instead, it was barely the middle of the tale. The best chapters were still waiting to be written." As they prepared to retire to their chamber, Ragnar took one last look around the hall that represented everything they'd fought to achieve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve their people and protect what they'd built together. There would be harvests to oversee, disputes to settle, visitors to welcome, knowledge to pass on to the next generation. But Tonight, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived and purposes fulfilled, she allowed herself the luxury of complete contentment. The woman who'd once stood silent and dismissed at a slave auction had reclaimed not just her noble birthright, but something far more precious, the knowledge that worth wasn't determined by others' judgments, but by the difference one chose to make in the world. The fire burned low as they made their way to bed, but its warmth would linger through the night, just as the warmth of their choices would echo through generations yet to come. In choosing compassion over conquest, healing over harming, they'd planted seeds that would grow long after their own stories ended, ensuring that the gentle strength they discovered together would outlive them both.